The 1920s gave women the right to vote, jazz clubs, flappers, and freedom. But behind the glittering facade of the Roaring Twenties was a suffocating web of etiquette rules, so strict, so strange, and so deeply unfair that most modern people wouldn't last a single day. Tonight, we're stepping back into that world. Not the world of champagne towers and Charleston dancing you've seen in the movies, but the real world, the one where a woman could lose her job for wearing the wrong colour, where a single raised eyebrow from the wrong person could end a marriage before it began, where the rules were never written down, never explained, and never ever questioned. So dim your lights, pull your blanket a little closer, and let yourself drift back to a time of cloche hats and curling irons, of parlour rooms and powder compacts, of 1,000 unspoken rules that shaped the lives of millions of women who simply had no choice but to follow them. This is the story of the bizarre etiquette rules 1920s women had to follow, and by the end of tonight you may find yourself grateful for every ordinary rule-free moment of your modern life. If you enjoy listening to stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine waking up on a cool autumn morning in 1922. The room around you is small and carefully arranged. A narrow bed with a white cotton coverlet tucked so tightly at the corners that not a single wrinkle dares show itself. A washstand with a ceramic pitcher and basin, the water cold from sitting overnight. A small oval mirror above the dresser, its silver backing beginning to spot with age at the corners. On the dresser itself, a modest collection of items arranged with precise intention. A hairbrush, a small pot of face cream, a bottle of rose water, a single strand of cultured pearls coiled neatly beside a folded handkerchief. Outside the window, the street is already beginning to stir. You can hear the distant clatter of milk bottles being set on doorsteps, the soft clop of a horse pulling a delivery cart over cobblestones, the muffled sound of a neighbour's radio drifting through the thin walls of the boarding house. The smell of coal smoke and autumn leaves and frying bread rises up from below, where the landlady is already in the kitchen, moving efficiently in the half-dark before sunrise. You have exactly 45 minutes to be presentable, not just dressed, not just clean, presentable. And in 1922, presentable is a word that carries the weight of an entire civilization on its 4 modest syllables. This is the world that millions of women woke up to every single morning in the decade we call the Roaring Twenties. And while history remembers the 20s for its jazz and its gin, and its glittering excess, the daily reality for most women, working women, middle-class women, young women navigating a world still largely controlled by men and manners, was something far quieter, far more constrained, and far more complicated than any Hollywood recreation has ever managed to capture. The 1920s were a decade of extraordinary contradiction. On one hand, everything was changing. In 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, granting women the right to vote after decades of tireless, often dangerous, always courageous activism. Women were entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers, working as secretaries, telephone operators, shop girls, nurses, teachers, and in some remarkable cases as journalists, lawyers, and even politicians. The silhouette of women's fashion was shifting dramatically, with hemlines rising and corsets loosening, and the rigid hourglass shape of the Victorian era giving way to something altogether more free and modern. Flappers, those bold, bright, short-haired young women who danced in speakeasies and smoked cigarettes in long holders and wore their stockings rolled down to their knees, became the iconic image of the era. They were real, they existed. They were dazzling and defiant and genuinely revolutionary in their own way. But they were also a minority. For the vast majority of women living through the 1920s, the decade was not a liberation. It was a negotiation, a careful, daily, exhausting negotiation between the world that was changing around them and the world that existed before them. A world built on rules, expectations, and a social architecture so deeply embedded in everyday life that most women had internalized it completely by the time they were old enough to understand it. These rules governed everything: how you walked, how you sat, how you spoke and to whom and in what tone of voice, what you ate and how much, what you wore and what colours and what fabrics and what hour of the day made each choice appropriate or inappropriate, how you entered a room, how you left it, how you acknowledged the people inside it, whether you could laugh, and if so, how loudly, whether you could express an opinion, and if so, on which subjects, whether you could be seen alone on a street, in a restaurant, in a shop, in a park, without a companion to vouch for your respectability. The rules were not written in any single book, though there were books, etiquette manuals and conduct guides and ladies' magazines that spelled out their expectations in tones ranging from gently instructive to quietly threatening. They were not enforced by any official authority, though the consequences of breaking them could feel very official indeed. Social exclusion, professional ruin, damaged marriage prospects, the slow and devastating withdrawal of a community's approval. They were simply the water that women swam in, present everywhere, visible to almost no one, impossible to escape. Let us begin with the morning, because the rules began the moment you opened your eyes. The first thing a respectable woman of the 1920s was expected to manage, before she spoke a single word to anyone, before she descended a single stair, was her appearance. And not merely her appearance in the practical sense, clean, clothed, hair brushed, but her appearance in the fullest social sense of the word. She was expected to look as though she had made an effort that was considerable, but not excessive, careful but not vain, polished but not theatrical. This balance was everything. Too little effort and you were slovenly. Careless, a woman who had let herself go, a phrase that carried in the 1920s an almost moral weight, as though a woman who failed to present herself properly had not merely neglected her appearance, but had abandoned some essential responsibility to the world around her. Too much effort, however, and you risked the opposite accusation: vanity, frivolity, the suggestion that you were trying too hard, drawing too much attention to yourself, performing for an audience in a way that was considered in polite circles rather vulgar. The ideal was invisible effort, the appearance of having simply woken up looking correct. This was, of course, a fiction maintained at considerable cost. The morning routine of a middle-class woman in the early 1920s typically began somewhere between 6 and 7 in the morning. She would rise, wash her face and hands at the basin. Bathing was not necessarily a daily event. Full baths were often taken 2 or 3 times a week, and even then required heating water and filling a tub by hand in most households, and begin the process of constructing her public self. Hair was an elaborate undertaking. The fashionable short bob of the era was genuinely revolutionary. Women had been wearing their hair long, pinned up in complex arrangements, for generations, but even a bobbed hairstyle required careful attention. It had to be clean, smooth, neatly shaped, and set correctly. Many women used curling irons heated on the stovetop, or slept in pin curls overnight to achieve the soft waves considered most becoming. Those who still wore their hair long faced an even more time-consuming process of brushing, pinning, and arranging it into an acceptable style. And all of this had to be completed, ideally, before any other member of the household saw you. The idea that a man, a husband, a father, a landlord, might see a woman in a state of incomplete presentation was considered, in many social circles, deeply embarrassing. Not just for the woman, but almost as a breach of social contract. You were expected to appear, always, as the finished version of yourself. The process of becoming that version was private, hidden, conducted behind closed doors with the quiet efficiency of a professional backstage crew. Dress came next, and dress in the 1920s was its own complex language. The decade saw genuinely dramatic changes in women's fashion. The dropped waistline, the shorter hem, the sleeveless or thin-strapped dress that would have been considered scandalous a generation before. But these changes were not universal, and they were not without their own strict rules of appropriateness. What was acceptable on a flapper in a jazz club on a Saturday night was emphatically not acceptable on a married woman attending church on Sunday morning, or on a working woman presenting herself at her office on a Monday. The rules about what to wear were not just about fashion. They were about signalling at every moment that you understood your role, your place, and the expectations that came with both. Colour was significant. Bright colours, vivid reds, electric blues, sharp yellows were associated with showiness, with a desire to attract attention that was considered at best youthful and at worst dangerous. A mature, respectable woman dressed in muted tones, navy, grey, brown, cream, pale pink, soft lavender. If she wore something brighter, she risked the raised eyebrow, the whispered comment, the knowing glance exchanged across a parlour room. Black was for mourning, and wearing it outside of mourning was considered either deeply fashionable in certain very modern circles or deeply inappropriate in most others. White was for summer, for young unmarried women, for garden parties and tennis. Pastels were safe for spring, darker, richer tones for autumn and winter. Getting this wrong was not a trivial error. It was a statement, whether you intended it or not, about who you were and how seriously you took the world's expectations of you. Fabric mattered too. Silk was expensive and therefore aspirational, but wearing silk in situations that did not warrant it was considered pretentious, an attempt to appear grander than your actual station. Cotton was practical and democratic, but too much cotton in the wrong context suggested poverty or carelessness. Wool was warm and respectable, but required careful maintenance to avoid looking dowdy. Lace was delicate and feminine, but had to be used sparingly to avoid looking overdone. And then there were the undergarments, which, while invisible to the outside world, were no less subject to their own strict expectations. A respectable woman wore the correct undergarments for her outfit, her age, her figure, and her social position. Corsets were becoming less rigid than they had been, but were still worn by many women, particularly older ones, as a matter of habit and expectation. The new brassiere, still a relatively recent invention, was beginning to replace the older camisole and corset combination, but only certain styles and sizes were considered appropriate for daytime versus evening wear. All of this before you had left your bedroom, before you had descended the stairs, before you had poured your first cup of tea and opened the morning newspaper that you were expected to read with intelligence and interest, but not to discuss too forcefully at the breakfast table if there were men present who might find strong female opinions on political matters unsettling before 9 in the morning. The world that 1920s women woke up to every day was not a cruel world exactly. It was not a world of obvious violence or overt oppression, though both of those things existed in its shadows. It was a world of extraordinary, suffocating, relentless expectation, a world in which the price of belonging, of being accepted, of moving through daily life without friction or shame or exclusion, was constant, vigilant, exhausting compliance with a set of rules so pervasive they had become invisible. And the remarkable thing, the thing that is perhaps most difficult for us to fully understand from where we stand 100 years later, is that most women did not experience these rules as oppression. Most experienced them simply as life, as the way things were, as the water they had always swum in, so familiar that its weight had ceased to register at all. That is perhaps the most powerful thing the rules accomplished. Not the compliance they demanded, but the invisibility they achieved. Let us walk deeper into that world now, and see what it looked like from the inside. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical labour, but from constant self-monitoring. From the perpetual internal awareness of how your body is positioned, how your face is arranged, what your hands are doing. Whether the angle of your shoulders or the speed of your walk or the sound of your breathing is, at any given moment, correct. This was the exhaustion that shaped the daily lives of women in the 1920s. Not the tiredness of hard work, though that was plentiful enough, but the deeper, more insidious tiredness of existing always under observation. Of understanding that your body, its size, its shape, its movements, its sounds, its very presence in a room, was subject at every moment to the judgment of the world around you. The rules governing women's bodies in the 1920s were not always stated explicitly. They did not need to be. They were transmitted through every etiquette manual, every magazine column, every mother's quiet correction, every lifted eyebrow from a social superior, every comment that began with the words, quote, 0 or quote 1, let us begin with posture, because posture was where everything started. The correct posture for a respectable woman of the 1920s was specific, demanding, and required years of practice to maintain naturally. The spine must be straight, not rigid, but effortlessly upright, suggesting a woman who had grown up with such good habits that correct posture required no conscious effort at all. The shoulders must be back and slightly down, neither hunched forward in a way that suggested timidity or fatigue, nor thrown back so aggressively that the chest was thrust forward in a manner considered unrefined. The chin must be level, not lifted in arrogance, not dropped in shyness, but poised at precisely the angle that suggested calm, pleasant self-possession, and this posture must be maintained at all times. while sitting, while standing, while walking, while eating, while speaking, while listening. The slightest slump was a betrayal of one's upbringing. A woman who slouched was a woman who had not been properly raised, or worse, a woman who had been properly raised and had chosen not to care, which was, in many social circles, considered an even more damning verdict. Walking was its own art form, governed by its own precise expectations. A respectable woman walked at a moderate pace, not so slowly that she appeared to be loitering, not so quickly that she appeared to be rushing, which was considered undignified and suggested either anxiety or insufficient planning. Her steps were small and even, her feet placed with care to avoid the wide, swinging stride considered masculine and therefore inappropriate. She did not swing her arms dramatically. She did not look around with obvious curiosity. Her gaze was directed forward, pleasantly alert but not actively scanning. To look around too eagerly was to appear either unsophisticated or suspiciously interested in things that were not your business. She did not run. Under any circumstances, in any social setting, a respectable woman did not run. Running was undignified, physically alarming to observers, and suggested a complete abandonment of the self-possession that was the cornerstone of feminine respectability. If something urgent required faster movement, a missed omnibus, a sudden shower, a lateness that could not be helped, a brisk, purposeful walk was the absolute maximum speed that could be deployed without social consequences. She did not make noise with her feet. Shoes that clattered or squeaked or slapped against the pavement were a source of embarrassment, evidence of either poor quality footwear or an insufficient attention to the sounds one's body made in the world. The ideal feminine walk was nearly silent, soft, precise, leaving the world undisturbed. Sitting was equally governed by expectation. A woman did not drop into a chair. She lowered herself into it in a single, controlled movement. Back straight, hands briefly touching the arms of the chair or folded in her lap, skirts smoothed beneath her as she sat in one practiced gesture. She sat with her knees together. This was perhaps the most universally emphasized physical rule of the era, so ingrained as to seem almost biological to many women who had grown up with it. Knees apart was simply not done. Under any circumstances, in any situation, regardless of how long you'd been seated, or how uncomfortable the chair, or how much your back ached. Your knees remained together. Ankles might be crossed, and often were. But even this required care, not crossed too high, which would raise the hem of the skirt above the acceptable point on the calf, and not swung in a way that drew attention to the feet. The hands were a particular preoccupation. Idle hands were not merely the devil's tools in the theological sense, they were also a social liability. A woman's hands in a social setting should always be doing something appropriate. If she was at the dinner table, they were occupied with cutlery, with a napkin, with the careful, deliberate management of food. In a parlour, they might be occupied with needlework or with a teacup. In conversation, they might rest folded in her lap or resting lightly on the arm of a chair. What they should not do was fidget, touch the face, drum on surfaces, pick at clothing, wave expressively during speech, gesture broadly to emphasize a point. All of these were considered markers of poor breeding, of uncontrolled feeling, of a failure to maintain the pleasant, composed surface that social life required. The face was perhaps the most surveilled territory of all. A woman's facial expression was expected in social settings to occupy a narrow band between too much and too little. Too little expression, a flat, unresponsive face, suggested coldness, arrogance, or stupidity. Too much expression, obvious emotion, exaggerated reactions, wide eyes and open mouth and visible feeling, was theatrical, vulgar, evidence of a woman who had not learned to keep her inner life appropriately private. The ideal expression was pleasant, alert, warmly interested without being agitated, amused without being convulsed, sympathetic without being overwrought. It was the expression of someone for whom nothing was ever so surprising, so funny, so upsetting, so outrageous that they lost control of their face. Laughter was a particular subject of etiquette concern. Women were expected to be cheerful, pleasant, good-humoured. These were considered feminine virtues. But the actual physical expression of amusement was heavily regulated. A lady's laugh was quiet, brief, and musical, a soft sound, not a shout, not a cackle, not a snort, not the kind of helpless, full-body laughter that makes your eyes water and your stomach hurt and your sense of dignity temporarily irrelevant. That kind of laughter was, in polite society, almost universally described as quote, _to, the word itself is instructive. Not wrong exactly, not immoral, but unbecoming. Not becoming of what a woman was supposed to be. A woman was not supposed to be a person who laughed until she cried. She was supposed to be a person who smiled pleasantly and said, quote 3, and maintained, even in moments of genuine hilarity, the essential composure that was the bedrock of her social identity. Crying was equally subject to strict regulation, though in a different direction. Some emotional expression in women was expected and even considered appropriate. Tears at a funeral, or at news of great personal loss, or at moments of overwhelming sentiment, were acceptable. A woman who never cried at all was cold, heartless, unwomanly. But tears at inconvenient moments, at the dinner table in a professional setting, in a social gathering, in response to frustration or anger rather than grief, were deeply problematic. They made others uncomfortable. They required others to respond, to comfort, to manage an emotion that had been allowed to become public in a way that was considered, in the 20s, rather self-indulgent. The ideal was control. Not the suppression of feeling was fine, feeling was womanly, but control over the public expression of feeling. Your emotions were yours. The world had not asked to witness them. Then there were the rules around the body's physical needs, eating, drinking, and the other biological requirements of human existence, all of which were subject to their own particular brand of 1920s social governance. Appetite in a woman was not supposed to be visible. This does not mean that women were expected to not eat. They were expected to eat, to maintain the health and energy required for their domestic and social responsibilities. But the act of eating, the desire for food, the visible enjoyment of it, these were to be kept carefully modulated. A woman at table did not load her plate. She did not take second helpings eagerly, or describe with enthusiasm the things she was most looking forward to eating, or make sounds of obvious pleasure while consuming something she found particularly delicious. Appetite, like emotion, was a private thing. Its public expression was vulgar. She ate slowly and deliberately, cutting small pieces, chewing thoroughly, setting down her utensils between bites in the manner prescribed by etiquette manuals. She did not eat quickly, even when hungry. She did not clean her plate entirely, leaving a small amount of food was considered more refined than consuming everything. A signal that one ate because one must, not because one wanted to. Alcohol was its own complicated territory. The 1920s were the years of prohibition in America. Legally, alcohol simply did not exist, though in practice it flowed with considerable enthusiasm through speakeasies and private parties across the country. In Britain and much of Europe, no such prohibition existed, but social rules around women and alcohol were no less present. A woman might drink wine with dinner, a cocktail at a party, sherry in the afternoon, but the quantity was watched. The manner in which it was consumed was watched. And anything that suggested the kind of frank and visible enjoyment of alcohol considered perfectly acceptable in men was, in a woman, a red flag. A woman who drank too enthusiastically, too quickly, too visibly, was a woman who could not be trusted. A woman who declined to drink at all, while admirable from a temperance perspective, risked appearing prim or antisocial in certain circles. The ideal, as always, was moderation, the appearance of a woman who was too refined to need excess in any direction. Tobacco was a newer controversy. Women's smoking in public was, in the early 1920s, a genuinely radical act, which is precisely why it was adopted with such enthusiasm by the flapper set. For the majority of women, however, smoking in public remained deeply transgressive throughout most of the decade. In private, among close friends, a cigarette might be permissible. In public, it was a statement, and most women, most of the time, were not in a position to make that particular statement without consequence. All of these rules, posture, movement, facial expression, appetite, the management of laughter and tears and hunger and thirst, shared a single underlying principle. The female body was not a private thing, belonging only to the woman who inhabited it. It was a public text, legible to everyone, and its legibility was a matter of social responsibility. Every choice about how you held your spine or directed your gaze or expressed your amusement was a statement about who you were, where you had come from, and whether you deserved to be taken seriously. Women learned this from girlhood. They learned it so thoroughly that by adulthood, most of the monitoring was internal, a constant quiet voice that ran alongside every other thought, keeping track of posture and expression and sound and movement, adjusting and correcting in real time before anyone else had the chance to notice something that needed correcting. It was, in many ways, a second full-time job. The job of being correctly, acceptably, safely female in a world that had very specific ideas about what that should look like. And it was a job that never ended. Not at home, not at rest, not even in sleep. Because the next morning would begin again, and the rules would still be there, as present and as invisible as air. If the bedroom was where the daily performance began, the parlour was where it reached its fullest and most demanding expression. The parlour, the sitting room, the drawing room, the front room, whatever name it went by and whatever household it occupied, was the central theatre of 1920s social life for middle-class women. It was the room in which visitors were received, in which relationships were maintained and managed, in which the delicate social architecture of community and reputation was built and occasionally demolished. It was, above all, the room in which a woman was most visible, most observed, and most thoroughly subject to the expectations of the world she inhabited. Everything about the parlour had rules. The room itself was expected to reflect the character of the woman who managed it, because in the 1920s the management of the home was considered a woman's primary professional responsibility, even if she also worked outside it. A well-kept parlour said everything about its mistress. That she was organised, tasteful, clean, attentive to detail, capable of maintaining standards even under the pressures of daily life. A parlour that was dusty, or poorly arranged, or in any way lacking in the quiet elegance expected of a respectable home, reflected directly and personally on the woman responsible for it. The furniture must be clean and arranged with apparent ease that actually required considerable thought. The cushions must be plumped. The surfaces must be dusted. The flowers, if there were any, must be fresh. Wilting flowers in a vase were considered almost as embarrassing as a poorly dressed hostess. The fireplace, if there was one, must be swept clean of ash before visitors arrived, or blazing pleasantly if the weather was cold enough to warrant a fire. The curtains must hang correctly. The carpet must be swept. Everything must suggest a household that was managed with effortless efficiency, that magical impression of a home that cared for itself, maintained by a woman who worked very hard to make her work invisible. But the physical parlour was only the setting. The real rules were about what happened inside it, the rituals of visiting and receiving, of conversation and tea, and the elaborate social choreography of women calling upon women. The custom of __quote_for__, formal social visits between women, was still a significant feature of middle-class social life in the early 1920s, though it was beginning to shift and modernise by the end of the decade. In its traditional form, calling operated by a precise set of rules that had evolved over the previous century into an almost bureaucratic system. A woman wishing to visit an acquaintance would leave her calling card, a small, elegantly printed card bearing her name, at the door if her acquaintance was not at home, or be received into the parlour if she was. The hours during which calls could properly be made were specific, typically from about 3 in the afternoon to 5 or 6, regardless of the term __quote_5_ that the practice was sometimes given. Calls before this time, or after it, were presumptuous. Calls at mealtimes were simply not made. The duration of a call was equally regulated. A first call, a visit to a new acquaintance or neighbour, should last between 15 and 30 minutes. Not less, as that suggested a reluctance to visit that was rude. Not more, as that overstayed one's welcome in a way that was also rude, just differently. Subsequent calls between established friends might last longer, but even these had a natural upper limit that the practiced social eye could read in the slight shift of the hostess's attention, the almost imperceptible glance toward the clock. Conversation during a call was its own sophisticated system, governed by a hierarchy of appropriate subjects and a set of topics so firmly off-limits that their very existence was rarely acknowledged. Appropriate topics for parlour conversation included the weather, with considerable thoroughness and genuine interest that might strike a modern observer as disproportionate, given that the weather's basic behaviour has not changed significantly in the intervening century. Local community events, charitable projects, church functions, neighbourhood improvements, books, particularly novels, though opinions must be offered with care to avoid seeming either too intellectual or too frivolous, music, art exhibitions, the health and progress of children. Fashion, in general terms, without specific reference to the cost of anything, which was considered deeply vulgar. Travel if one had travelled, or if the person one was visiting had recently returned from somewhere interesting. Inappropriate topics were numerous and carefully understood by every woman who had been properly raised. Money, specific figures, costs, prices, incomes, the financial difficulties of oneself or others, was not discussed in polite parlour conversation. This was considered one of the most fundamental rules of social discourse, and its violation was one of the most reliable markers of a person who had not grown up in a household where good manners were taught. Politics were deeply fraught, particularly in the 1920s, when women had only recently gained the vote in America and were still in the process of establishing their political identities. A woman might hold political opinions. She might even be admired for holding them in the right context. But loudly expressing partisan political views in a mixed social gathering, or with acquaintances whose political leanings were unknown, was considered aggressive and unbecoming. Religion was to be treated with great delicacy, acknowledged with respect but not debated, affirmed but not analysed. Personal matters, illness beyond the most general level of inquiry. Are you quite well? I'm so glad. Marital difficulties, financial trouble, family conflict were simply not appropriate. The rule was that the parlour was a place of pleasant social intercourse, and pleasant social intercourse required a tacit agreement to keep the genuinely difficult, complicated, painful aspects of life out of the room. This could make parlour conversation feel extraordinarily shallow to the woman of a more direct temperament. It could also, for the woman practised in its arts, feel like an enormously sophisticated form of communication, a language in which tremendous amounts of real information were exchanged through the careful navigation of what was said, and far more importantly what was not. Tea was served during calls, and the service of tea was its own elaborate performance. The hostess poured. Always the hostess poured. It was her domain, her responsibility, and the quality of her tea service and the smoothness of its administration were reflections of her competence as a social manager. The tea must be properly made, the pot warmed first, the tea leaves measured precisely, the water added at exactly the right temperature, the pot allowed to steep for the correct number of minutes. Too weak and it was careless, too strong and it was overpowering. The ideal cup of tea was another example of the decade's great social principle. Perfect, effortless moderation. The cups must be offered in order of social precedence, the most senior guest first, the others in sequence, and offered with accompanying plates for biscuits or small cakes, depending on the formality of the occasion. A guest who helped herself before being offered was being forward. A guest who declined too many things was being difficult, or suggesting that the offerings were insufficient. A guest who ate too eagerly was being greedy. The ideal guest was appreciative, moderate, and slightly but not excessively complimentary about the quality of the refreshments. There were rules about when to leave that were perhaps the most delicate navigation of the entire visit. A guest did not stay until asked to leave. That was obviously too long. But neither did she leave so abruptly that her hostess felt the visit had been unwelcome or the company insufficient. The art of departing gracefully from a social call was genuinely skilled work, requiring the ability to read the subtle signals of a social situation accurately, and to transform her reading into action without any appearance of calculation. She would begin to show signs of intended departure, a slight shift in position, a glance toward her gloves, a more conclusive note in her conversation, and wait to see if her hostess showed any signs of wishing her to stay. If the hostess leaned forward, offered more tea, opened a new subject of conversation, the visit was welcome to continue a little longer. If the hostess's response was warm but not expansive, not introducing any new conversational thread, making no move toward the teapot, that was the signal to gather herself and make the formal process of departure. The farewell itself was pleasant, brief, and without the lingering quality that in the 21st century accompanies so many social goodbyes. the long conversations conducted in hallways and at car doors and on doorsteps that extend the visit past its natural end. In the 1920s, once departure was announced, it was accomplished with reasonable efficiency. Promises to visit again were made with sincerity and with the understanding that they carried actual social obligation. Calling cards were exchanged if the visit established a new friendship. Coats were collected, the door was reached, goodbyes were exchanged at the threshold with warmth and precision. And then the parlour was empty again, and the hostess had approximately 15 minutes to restore it to its original state of ready perfection before the next caller might arrive. This was the daily reality of social life for women of a certain class in the 1920s. Not grand events and elaborate entertainments. Those existed, but they were exceptions. The fabric of everyday social life was made of these small, precise, enormously rule-governed visits and teas and conversations, repeated across neighbourhoods and towns and cities, maintaining the invisible social structure that kept everything in its right place and everyone in their appropriate role. And everywhere in this system, women were both its participants and its primary enforcers. It was women who called upon women, women who hosted women, women who taught their daughters the precise angle of the elbow while pouring tea, women who exchanged the quiet signal of the raised eyebrow that meant, without any words being required, that someone had committed a social error they would be expected to correct before the next occasion. This was one of the great paradoxes of the system, that the people most constrained by it were also its most dedicated guardians. Women policed each other with an attention to detail and a consistency that no external authority could have matched, because the rules were internalized. Because to be the woman who upheld them correctly was to be a woman who belonged, who was respected, who was safe within the social world. And to be the woman who failed to uphold them, or worse, to be the woman who questioned whether they needed upholding, was to risk something that felt, to many women, more frightening than any external punishment. It was to risk being outside, excluded, judged and found wanting by the very community that made daily life possible and bearable, and, in its better moments, warm. That was the deepest power of the parlour and its politics, not the rules themselves, precise and petty as they sometimes were, but the world those rules maintained, a world of belonging and recognition and shared identity that was genuinely precious to the women who lived inside it, even as it cost them, every single day, a freedom they may not always have had words for wanting. Perhaps nowhere in the life of a 1920s woman were the rules more intricate, more consequential, or more constantly present than in the arena of courtship and romance. Because courtship was not merely a private matter between two people who found each other interesting and wished to spend time together. It was a public performance, with an audience that watched closely, judged carefully, and expected the performers to know all their lines without being given a script. Marriage was, for the majority of women in the 1920s, not merely one possible life path among many. It was still, for most women of most classes and backgrounds, the primary economic and social structure within which adult life was expected to be conducted. A woman who did not marry was a woman whose status was perpetually precarious, financially vulnerable, socially marginal, permanently in a position of having somehow failed to achieve the central achievement her world expected of her. This is not to say that all women wanted to marry, or that all unmarried women were miserable. There were women who chose independence, who built professional lives and communities of friends that sustained them without a husband. There were women whose relationships with other women were the true centres of their emotional lives. There were women who simply found that the available candidates for marriage were insufficient incentive to surrender their independence. But these women existed within a social structure that regarded their situation as, at best, unfortunate and at worst, suspicious. The pressure to marry and to marry well and to navigate the process of attracting a suitable husband, without violating any of the extensive rules governing that process, was one of the constant background pressures of female life in the 1920s. Courtship began, in its most formal sense, with introduction. An introduction was governed by its own careful protocol. A young woman could not simply approach a young man she found interesting and introduce herself. Such directness was considered forward, bold, and, that most damning of 1920s social words, fast. To be fast was to move too quickly, too eagerly, too visibly toward what you wanted, in a way that suggested insufficient restraint and control. Proper introduction required an intermediary, a mutual acquaintance, a family friend, a hostess at a social event, who could make the introduction with appropriate ceremony, establishing the social context of both parties and providing the implicit endorsement that this was a meeting between two people of sufficient social compatibility to warrant each other's time. Once introduced, the rules around how a young woman might interact with a young man were specific and demanding. She could speak to him in social settings, but she must not monopolize his attention. She could show interest, but must not show too much interest, too quickly. Eagerness was unattractive, and more than that, it weakened her negotiating position in the subtle social game of courtship. She must be pleasant and engaging enough to make herself attractive, but must never give the impression that she was trying to be those things. The performance must appear effortless. A young man who was genuinely interested would begin to show it through a series of incremental steps, each governed by its own expectations. He might call at her home, in person, with his hat in his hands and his most presentable manners deployed, to pay a formal visit. This visit would be conducted in the parlour, in the presence of her mother or another appropriate chaperone, and would follow the same general rules as any parlour call, with the additional charge of allowing both parties to assess each other as potential partners, while appearing merely to be having a pleasant social conversation about nothing in particular. The chaperone was not, in the 1920s, the absolute requirement she had been in the Victorian era. By the early part of the decade, particularly in urban areas and among younger women, some degree of unchaperoned interaction had become socially acceptable. A young woman might walk in a park with a young man, or attend a public entertainment with him, without requiring a third party to be present every moment. But the principle underlying the chaperone, that a woman's reputation was a fragile thing that required protection, and that protection came through the visible presence of appropriate social supervision, had not disappeared. It had merely become somewhat less formally enforced. What remained entirely intact was the understanding that a woman's reputation was her most valuable social asset, and that it could be damaged, sometimes irreparably, by any action that allowed others to question her respectability. And the things that could damage a reputation were many, varied, and sometimes apparently trivial. Being seen alone with a man at an unsuitable hour, after dark, or in a location that did not have the public respectable quality of a park or a concert hall was damaging. Being seen too frequently with the same man without any official announcement of engagement was damaging, because it suggested a relationship whose nature was unclear, and unclear was almost always assumed to be improper. Showing too much physical affection in public, holding hands was acceptable by the mid-1920s in many contexts. But any more demonstrative expression of physical feeling was considered inappropriate, was damaging. Even being seen to receive a man's compliments with too much evident pleasure could be read as a sign of insufficient modesty. The gift of flowers was a particular minefield. A young man might send flowers to a young woman he admired. This was conventional and expected. But flowers sent without the accompanying formality of a proper courtship context, or sent in such quantities as to be overwhelming, or accompanied by a note whose language exceeded the social formality appropriate to the stage of the relationship, could create significant complications. What kind of flowers were sent also mattered. Red roses were for romantic love. Their receipt from a man who had not made his intentions formally clear was a statement of alarming directness. White flowers were innocent and appropriate for early courtship. More exotic or unusual flowers suggested a worldliness that might be exciting, but was also in some circles slightly alarming. Letters were another critical element of 1920s courtship, and they were governed by some of the most detailed rules in the entire etiquette system. A young woman was not supposed to write to a young man unless they were engaged. To do so was to establish an intimacy that had not been formally sanctioned, and in a world where letters were sometimes read by others, sometimes preserved as evidence of a relationship's nature, the risks of premature correspondence were real. A man might write to a young woman if the courtship was sufficiently advanced, but she must reply with care, warmly enough to encourage, formally enough to protect, never in language that, read by an outsider, could be interpreted as compromising. The engagement itself was the great turning point. Once a couple was formally engaged, meaning, in most cases, that the young man had spoken to the young woman's father to ask permission to marry her, and her father had agreed, and the couple had then agreed privately, and the announcement had been made to both families and to society. A great many rules that had previously applied simply fell away. Engaged couples could be seen together unchaperoned with much greater freedom. They could correspond openly. They could appear together at social events as a unit and be recognised as such. But even engagement carried its own rules. The engagement ring, a relatively new custom that was becoming increasingly standardised in the 1920s, partly through the effective marketing of jewellers who had recently hit upon the idea, must be worn consistently and correctly. The period of engagement must be managed with decorum on both sides. And the wedding itself, when it came, must be conducted according to its own extraordinarily detailed set of expectations, covering everything from the style of the invitations to the seating arrangement at the reception to the appropriate length of the bride's train. The rules of courtship were, in many ways, the rules of the entire system in miniature. They were built on the principle that women's desires for connection, for love, for the security of a stable partnership, were real and legitimate, but that their expression must be so carefully managed and so precisely calibrated to social expectation that the desire itself was rendered almost invisible. The ideal 1920s woman moved through courtship as though she were merely allowing things to happen to her, as though her own wishes and assessments and strategic choices were not part of the story at all, as though romance simply unfolded around her rather than being actively shaped by her intelligence and intention. This was, of course, entirely fictitious. Women in the 1920s were perfectly capable of knowing what they wanted and finding ways to work toward it. But the rules required that this knowledge and this effort remain hidden, that the appearance maintained at all times was of a woman who was simply waiting, pleasantly and without visible impatience, for life to arrange itself appropriately around her. In the quiet of the parlour, over the teacups and the calling cards and the carefully chosen flowers, enormous amounts of real human feeling and real human strategy moved through a system designed to contain them and managed somehow to survive. By the time a woman of the 1920s sat down to a formal dinner, she had already navigated enough rules to exhaust most modern people before the soup arrived. But the dinner table, whether a family dinner, a formal dinner party, a restaurant meal, or a more casual luncheon with friends, was its own complete universe of expectation, with rules covering every aspect of the experience from the moment she took her seat to the moment she rose from it. Let us imagine a dinner party. Not an extraordinarily grand one, not a state banquet or a great society occasion, but a respectable middle-class dinner party, the kind hosted in a comfortable home by a woman who understood her social responsibilities and took them seriously. 8 or 10 guests, a proper table set with all the appropriate equipment, food of sufficient quality and variety to reflect well on the household, and a hostess who's been planning and managing this event for several days. The first rule of a dinner party, for a female guest, was punctuality. Not the aggressive punctuality of arriving before the designated hour. That was considered inconsiderate, as it might catch the hostess in a state of incomplete preparation and would place both host and guest in an uncomfortable position. But neither the fashionable lateness that in certain very modern circles was considered sophisticated. The proper arrival time was within 5 to 10 minutes of the stated hour, close enough to demonstrate respect for the hostess's invitation, but not so precise as to create pressure. She arrived in the correct dress. Dinner in the 1920s required a different level of dress from daytime, and the gradations between a simple family dinner and a formal dinner party were real and expected to be read correctly. An evening dress was longer than a day dress, more elaborate in its details, made of richer fabric. Jewellery that would be inappropriate in the daytime, pearl necklaces, diamond earrings, more elaborate brooches, became appropriate in the evening. Hair was dressed more formally. The whole presentation was elevated, but within the specific limits of the occasion. A simple dinner did not warrant the most elaborate evening gown, and wearing one would create the uncomfortable impression that you had mistaken the importance of the event or were trying too hard to impress. She was greeted by her hostess. She spoke pleasantly to the other guests during any period before dinner was announced, and she went into dinner in the correct order, which in more formal settings was determined by social precedence, with the most senior or most distinguished guests entering first, usually escorted by a male guest of appropriate standing. She was seated. The seating arrangement at a formal dinner was typically arranged by the hostess in advance, and the placement reflected the hostess's assessment of social compatibility, conversational potential, and the various hierarchies of status and connection that made up the invisible architecture of any social gathering. A woman sat where she was directed to sit. She did not rearrange place cards. She did not comment audibly on her placement, whatever she might feel about it privately. The table itself was set according to its own precise rules. Multiple forks, multiple knives, multiple spoons, each intended for a specific course and to be used in the correct order, working from the outside in. Bread plate on the left, water glass at the top right, wine glasses in their specific positions, a napkin folded in the appropriate style and unfolded at the appropriate moment, when she sat down, ideally in a single smooth gesture, placed in the lap with a minimum of drama and a maximum of quietness. And then the meal began, and the rules truly multiplied. The spoon never travelled toward the mouth. It travelled away from the body. The soup lifted from the far side of the bowl rather than scooped directly. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all table manner rules, and one that required considerable conscious practice before it became natural. It was done this way, tradition maintained, to avoid the risk of dripping soup on one's clothing. The outward movement carried the liquid away from the diner, while an inward scoop would bring it over the lap. Practical, perhaps. Deeply unnatural, certainly. She did not hold her knife like a pen. She held it with the handle in the palm, the index finger extended along the back of the blade, a grip that gave more control over the cutting motion and was considered the mark of good breeding. She did not cut her bread roll into pieces. She broke off small pieces by hand and buttered each piece individually before eating it. Buttering the entire roll at once was the kind of thing a person did who had not been properly taught. She did not speak with food in her mouth. She did not reach across another guest for something she needed. She asked, quietly and politely, for it to be passed. She did not begin eating before the hostess, or before all the women at the table had been served. She did not eat too quickly. She did not visibly savour her food in a way that drew attention to the physical pleasure of eating. She did not comment critically on any dish. Gratitude to the hostess was expressed pleasantly regardless of whether the food merited it. Conversation at the dinner table moved in a specific pattern in formal settings. Traditionally, a woman at a dinner party was expected to talk to the guest on her right for the first part of the meal and then, at an unmarked but somehow universally understood signal, usually when the second course arrived, to turn and give equivalent attention to the guest on her left. Neglecting either neighbour for too long was a social failure that the neglected party would notice, and that the hostess would also notice, filing it away as a mark of conversational incompetence on the offending guest's part. The range of appropriate dinner table conversation was somewhat broader than parlour conversation. The presence of men, the slightly more festive occasion, the wine that accompanied the meal, all of these created slightly more latitude than the afternoon call allowed. But the fundamental prohibitions remained. No money, no religion, no politics in the partisan sense, no personal matters. The ideal dinner party conversation had what etiquette manuals sometimes called the quality of sprightliness. It was lively, varied, interesting, witty without being sharp-edged, curious without being probing. A woman was expected to be a good conversationalist, not a fascinating one necessarily. Fascinating could shade into the kind of overwhelming personality that made other guests feel upstaged, and that was a social liability. But good, the kind of guest who contributed pleasantly to the general atmosphere, who listened as well as she spoke, who drew out quieter neighbours rather than dominating the table, who showed interest in subjects beyond her own expertise, who laughed at humour appropriately and was not offended by things that were not genuinely offensive. After the meal came the moment of separation. In formal dinner party convention, after the dessert course was completed, the hostess would give the signal for the women to withdraw from the table, leaving the men to their port and whatever conversation they preferred to have without female company present. The women would retire to the drawing room, where coffee was served and conversation continued among themselves. This custom was, by the 1920s, beginning to feel somewhat anachronistic in many circles. Younger, more modern hostesses were abandoning it entirely, preferring to keep the company together after dinner. But in more traditional households, and at more formal occasions, the withdrawal continued, and a woman who failed to follow the hostess's signal, or who expressed visible reluctance to leave the table, was making a statement that most women preferred not to make in someone else's home. When the men rejoined the women, usually after 20 minutes to half an hour, the gathering continued as a whole, moving into the final hours of the evening where conversation became more general, where some guests might play or sing at the piano if the hostess had one, where the careful social work of the dinner party began to relax slightly into something warmer and less formally governed. The departure from a dinner party carried its own etiquette. One did not leave immediately after coffee. That suggested impatience, a desire to be elsewhere, a failure to value the hospitality offered. But neither did one stay so long that the household's comfort required one's departure. The ideal departure time was calculated by reading the room. The shifting energy of the gathering, the faint signs of tiredness in the hostess's face, the gradually thinning company as other guests began to make their farewells. Once the process of departure began, it was efficient. Warm thanks to the hostess, expressed with genuine feeling, brief goodbyes to the other remaining guests, coats collected from the hall and out into the night. The following day, this was absolutely expected, absolutely non-negotiable. A note must be sent to the hostess. Not a telephone call, not a casual mention the next time you happen to see her, but a proper written note on good paper thanking her for the dinner. The note was brief, specific enough to feel genuine and warm. It acknowledged the pleasure of the evening and named some specific element, the food, a particular conversation. The beauty of the table arrangements, to demonstrate that the thanks were not merely formulaic. It was delivered promptly, ideally the next morning, and it was the completion of the social ritual that had begun with the acceptance of the invitation. Miss this note, and you had failed in one of the most basic obligations of social life. Send it too late, and you had been careless. Send it on the wrong paper, or write it in a tone that was either too effusive or too cool, and you had shown poor judgment. The thank you note was, in its small way, a final test, the last opportunity to demonstrate that you were, in all things, the kind of woman who could be relied upon to do the right thing, in the right way, at the right time, as always. By the 1920s, the number of women working outside the home had grown significantly. The First World War had pulled women into the workforce in large numbers, and while many had returned to domestic life when the men came home, the shift was not entirely reversed. Young single women, in particular, worked in ever-increasing numbers as clerks, typists, telephone operators, shop girls, nurses, teachers, and in a growing range of professional roles that had previously been almost entirely male. This was, in its way, genuinely new. And like all genuinely new things in a world governed by old rules, it created friction, because the rules that governed women's behaviour had been designed for a world in which women's primary sphere was domestic, and they had not been updated to accommodate a woman who spent her day in an office or a department store or a hospital ward. The result was a set of expectations that were, in retrospect, quite breathtakingly contradictory. A working woman was expected to maintain all of the standards of feminine respectability that applied to women who stayed at home: the careful dress, the correct manner, the appropriate social behaviour, the vigilant protection of her reputation. She was expected to do this while also demonstrating sufficient competence, reliability and intelligence to justify her employment. And she was expected to do both of these things simultaneously, in environments designed by and for men, without complaint and without the kind of directness or assertiveness that might make her male colleagues uncomfortable. The workplace had its own elaborate set of rules for women, some official, most unofficial and understood. Dress at work was subject to expectations even more specific than those governing social life, because at work dress was also about professional credibility. A working woman must dress with care. This was assumed without question. But she must not dress in a way that seemed to be trying to attract attention, because attracting attention in the workplace was not a professional ambition but a social danger. She must dress with sufficient neatness and propriety to reflect well on the establishment that employed her, without dressing so fashionably or so expensively that she seemed to be placing her personal appearance above her professional responsibilities. Colour, as always, mattered. Dark, quiet colours were considered appropriate for professional settings: navy, grey, brown, black. Brighter colours were appropriate only in jobs where they were specifically required, or where the public-facing nature of the work demanded a certain kind of visual pleasantness, as in a shop or a hotel reception. Jewellery was kept minimal, a small brooch perhaps, or simple earrings. Anything more elaborate was considered insufficiently professional, a distraction. Hair at work was worn conservatively. The bob was acceptable, but it must be neat, smooth, controlled. Any style that was particularly fashionable or eye-catching was considered inappropriate for a professional setting. A woman's appearance at work should be pleasant and clean and correct, but it should not be the sort of thing that people noticed or commented upon. The ideal was invisibility, the appearance that required no comment, that simply met expectations so completely that it did not register as a choice at all. Behaviour in the workplace was governed by expectations that placed women in an almost impossible position. She must be efficient and competent, that was why she was employed, but she must not be so obviously efficient and competent that she made her male colleagues feel threatened, which was a real and recognised danger in 1920s workplaces. She must be pleasant and cooperative, but not so friendly that she was perceived as flirtatious, a line that was remarkably easy to cross accidentally in an environment where any warmth between men and women was automatically read through the lens of sexual possibility. She must take direction from her superiors without objection, but must also use sufficient judgment and initiative to handle the day-to-day demands of her job without requiring constant supervision. She was expected to be grateful for the opportunity to work. The idea that she might have views about the conditions of her employment, the pay, which was consistently lower than that of men doing the same jobs, the hours, which were long, the limitations on advancement, which were very real, the expectation that she would resign upon marriage, which was a written rule in many companies and an assumed expectation in most, was considered inappropriate. These were the terms of the arrangement. A woman who accepted employment accepted them. The marriage bar, the rule, formal or informal, that women must leave their jobs when they married, was perhaps the most consequential of all the workplace rules that governed women in the 1920s. In many industries and institutions, it was simply stated as policy. No married women employed. In others, it was not written anywhere but was understood as the expectation. A woman who married and attempted to continue working was regarded with suspicion, as a woman who was taking a job that a man, or an unmarried woman who truly needed it, could have had. She was, in the language of the times, taking bread from another's mouth. This rule had the effect of making women's professional lives fundamentally temporary in a way that men's were not. A woman might spend years building skills, knowledge, and professional relationships, investing in a career that she would be expected to abandon the moment she married. Some women delayed marriage for this reason, a choice that carried its own social costs, as a woman who remained unmarried past a certain age was subject to the particular social anxieties around spinsterhood. Others left work reluctantly, under social pressure, while others genuinely wanted the opportunity to focus on domestic life. Whatever their individual feelings, the rule treated all women's professional ambitions as inherently provisional, subject to cancellation by the fact of marriage. The double standard was not something that most working women of the 1920s would have necessarily named as a double standard. The language of that concept had not yet fully developed, but they felt it, in the daily experience of being expected to work to the same standards as men while being paid less, treated as less serious, assumed to be temporary, and subject to a set of behavioural expectations that had no male equivalent. A man could eat lunch at his desk or step outside to smoke, or raise his voice in a meeting, or express direct disagreement with a superior's decision, without these things having any significance beyond the immediate moment. A woman who did any of these things was making a statement. She was, with each small departure from the expected feminine script, demonstrating something about her character, her reliability, her professionalism, her womanliness, because in the 1920s workplace, womanliness and professionalism were supposed to coexist, but the terms of their coexistence were defined by others, and the woman herself had very little say in where the lines were drawn. And yet, women worked. Millions of them, every day, navigating the double standard with the same practiced efficiency they brought to every other system of rules they inhabited. They found ways to be competent without being threatening, pleasant without being flirtatious, ambitious without being aggressive. They made friendships with colleagues, built professional reputations, developed skills that outlasted their formal employment even when the marriage bar ended their careers. They organised. There were women's trade unions, women's professional associations, women's networks of mutual support and information that existed alongside and sometimes within the official structures of working life. They were, in other words, doing what women throughout the decade were doing everywhere, working within a system that was not designed for them, finding the spaces within its constraints where real life could be lived, and doing it well enough that the system continued to function, even as it slowly began to change. The 1920s were, in the history of women's beauty culture, a decade of genuine revolution. The cosmetics industry, which had previously existed in a somewhat shadowy social space, face paint and rouge were associated with actresses and women of doubtful virtue, not with respectable middle-class femininity, underwent a transformation in the 20s that fundamentally changed its social status. This transformation was driven by a number of factors. The rise of Hollywood, which gave mass audiences their first sustained exposure to the dramatically made-up faces of movie stars, created an appetite for cosmetics among ordinary women who wished to approximate those glamorous images. The development of new cosmetic products, better lipstick formulations, face powders in a wider range of shades, mascara, eyeshadow, made beauty products more usable and more widely available. And the general social shifts of the decade, particularly the emergence of the flapper as a cultural icon, made visible deliberate cosmetic enhancement a marker of modernity rather than impropriety. By the mid-1920s, the use of at least some cosmetics had become not just acceptable, but expected for most women in urban areas. A woman who used no cosmetics at all risked looking pale and unwell by the standards of the day, or worse, dowdy. A woman who had not kept up with the times. The pale, natural face of the Victorian ideal was being replaced, fairly rapidly, by a standard of feminine beauty that required active maintenance. But, and this was the essential tension of 1920s beauty culture, the maintenance must not show. Or rather, it must show in exactly the right way, to exactly the right degree, in exactly the right context. The rules around cosmetics were specific and unforgiving. Powder was acceptable, even respectable, for daytime wear. A light application of face powder, which smoothed the complexion and reduced shine, was considered perfectly appropriate for any social occasion. A woman might carry a small powder compact and touch up her powder during the course of a day without social comment. Lipstick was more fraught. By the early 1920s, lipstick had moved from the theatrical into everyday use, but it carried different weight in different contexts. For young women, particularly those in fashionable urban circles, a bright lip was a statement of modernity. For older women, or in more conservative communities, bright lipstick remained associated with a certain kind of boldness that was not universally admired. The acceptable shade was, as always, the moderate one, enough colour to suggest vitality and attention to appearance, not so much as to suggest a desire for attention. Rouge, applied to the cheeks, occupied similar territory. A natural-looking flush was desirable. The exaggerated circular spot of rouge applied in the manner of the more extreme fashion plates of the period was, in most social circles, considered excessive and slightly ridiculous. The key word was always __quote_8___. The ideal was that your cosmetic enhancements looked as though they might not be enhancements at all. Mascara and eye makeup were the most carefully regulated of all cosmetic choices. Eye makeup was theatrical, dramatic. It was associated with actresses and with the more extreme end of fashionable society. In conservative circles, visible eye makeup on an ordinary woman was considered fast. In more fashionable ones, a careful darkening of the lashes might be acceptable. But the rule held. Anything that drew obvious attention to the application of cosmetics was, in most social contexts, too much. The underlying principle of 1920s beauty culture was the same as the underlying principle of almost everything else in women's social lives in the decade. Visible effort was the enemy of good taste. You were supposed to look well because you simply were well, healthy, youthful, naturally attractive, blessed by nature with pleasant features and a good complexion. If you needed help to achieve these things, that help was supposed to be so skillfully applied as to be invisible. A woman who looked made up was a woman who had failed at the central task of beauty culture, which was to look as though she required no beauty culture at all. This was an extraordinary demand. It required significant time, money, skill and practice to apply cosmetics in a way that suggested their absence. And then it required women to pretend that none of this time and money and effort had been spent, because to acknowledge the work was to destroy the effect the work was trying to create. hair was its own long chapter in the story of 1920s beauty rules. The short bob, which became the defining hairstyle of the decade, was genuinely radical when it first appeared. Not merely a fashion choice, but a statement, because cutting off hair that women had worn long for generations was understood by both its enthusiasts and its critics as a rejection of a specifically feminine tradition. Women who bobbed their hair in the early 20s were sometimes met with genuine distress from parents and husbands, who experienced the cut as a loss of something they felt they had a claim to. But the bob spread, rapidly and widely, because it was practical and modern and suited the new fashion silhouette, and because the social risk of wearing it decreased as more women adopted it. By the mid-1920s, a bobbed or shingled haircut was no longer a radical statement in most contexts. It was simply the fashionable thing. What remained constant was the requirement that the hair, whatever its length or style, be clean, neat, and appropriately styled for the occasion and time of day. Perfume was delicate territory. A light application of a pleasant fragrance was acceptable, and even considered refined. But too much perfume, or a perfume that was too heavy or too sweet, was considered vulgar. It suggested that you were trying to make yourself noticed through scent, which was a form of the same performance and excess that excessive cosmetics represented. And a woman who smelled of nothing but soap and clean clothes was perfectly respectable, more respectable in some circles than one who wore any scent at all. The cost of all this was rarely discussed openly because discussing money was itself against the rules. But the reality was that maintaining the appearance of effortless, appropriate femininity was genuinely expensive. Good clothing was not cheap. Cosmetics, the new commercial ones, properly manufactured, reliably consistent in quality, cost money. Getting one's hair cut and styled required regular visits to a hairdresser. Accessories, the gloves, the handbag, the hat, the shoes that each outfit required, multiplied the expense substantially. The hat deserves particular attention because the hat was perhaps the most rule-governed accessory in the entire wardrobe. A woman in the 1920s simply did not appear in public without a hat. This was not a fashion preference. It was a social expectation so fundamental as to be effectively a rule of public life. A woman without a hat in a public space was a woman who appeared incomplete, like a man without his collar or a house without its front door. She might be forgiven if she was very young, or if the context was so casual and outdoor as to make the omission understandable. In any other circumstance, the hat was required. But the hat could not be just any hat. The style of hat must suit the occasion, the time of day, the formality of the dress, and the season. The cloche hat, that close-fitting helmet of felt or straw that became so closely associated with the decade, was fashionable and appropriate for many daytime occasions. More elaborate hats with wider brims and more decorative elements were appropriate for afternoon events and for occasions of some ceremony. The rules were not written in any single place, but any woman of the 20s would have been able to tell you, with perfect confidence, whether the hat you were wearing was the right hat for the moment. And then there were gloves. Like the hat, gloves in public were not optional. For formal occasions and most daytime outings, a respectable woman wore gloves. She removed them to eat and to shake hands, though even this had some variance in the rules, since a woman's hand was customarily kissed, not shaken, in more formal continental settings, and in that case the glove might remain on, but otherwise they stayed on. Long white gloves for formal evening occasions, shorter gloves in leather or kid for daytime. The colour must coordinate with the rest of the outfit. What all of this adds up to, when you stand back and look at it whole, is a picture of women's lives that was almost entirely devoted, in its surface expression, its visible presentation to the world, to appearance. Not appearance as vanity, but appearance as language. Every choice about dress and hair and cosmetics and hat and gloves was a statement in a language that everyone around you was fluent in, and that they were reading constantly, consciously or not. To dress correctly was to say, I belong here, I understand the rules, I respect the community standards, I am the kind of woman who can be trusted, who is respectable, who is safe. To dress incorrectly, too fashionably or not fashionably enough, too expensively or too cheaply, too much colour or not enough the wrong hat for the occasion, was to say, inadvertently but unmistakably, the opposite of all those things. and because women had so few other languages available to them, so few ways of asserting identity, competence, or ambition in public spaces that were acknowledged and taken seriously, the language of appearance became, in some ways, the richest and most complex language women had. A language of extraordinary precision, maintained at extraordinary cost, and yet speaking volumes, always, to everyone who had learned to read it. There is a particular quality to the rules that were never written anywhere. They were in many ways the most powerful rules of all, because without being written, they could not be argued with. You could not point to a written rule and question whether it was fair or reasonable or necessary. You could not trace its origin or examine its logic or petition for its revision. It simply was. Everyone knew it. And the fact that everyone knew it without being told was the most effective enforcement mechanism imaginable. These unwritten rules governed the spaces between the written ones, the daily texture of female life that no etiquette manual had quite gotten around to specifying, but that every woman navigated as surely as if the rules had been carved into the walls of every room she entered. One of the most pervasive unwritten rules concerned the management of others' comfort. A woman was expected, in almost any social situation, to be the primary manager of the emotional and social comfort of the people around her. If there was awkwardness, she smoothed it. If there was silence, she filled it pleasantly. If there was conflict, she found the diplomatic path between the parties. If someone was unhappy, she noticed and responded. If the room was too warm or too cold, or the conversation was going in a direction that made someone uncomfortable, she was supposed to perceive this and do something about it, subtly, efficiently, without drawing attention to the fact that she was doing it. This was not a rule anyone had agreed to. It was simply assumed, so thoroughly assumed that its absence in any particular woman was experienced by those around her as a kind of failure, a lack of social skill or social empathy. Quote 9 was a criticism that could attach itself to a woman for years. The expectation that she would notice, that she would feel responsible for the comfort of others as an almost reflexive function of being female in a social setting, was so deeply embedded as to feel natural rather than imposed. Related to this was the rule of grateful minimization. A woman who was given a compliment was expected to minimize it, to deflect it, to turn it back toward the giver, to respond with warmth, but without the kind of simple, direct acceptance of praise that in a man would be considered confidence, and in a woman was considered vanity. Quote 10, quote 11, quote 12. The formula was so practiced as to be nearly automatic, accepting a compliment with simple. Unqualified pleasure was considered immodest. The correct response was always some version of diminishment. There was also the unwritten rule of the invisible opinion. Women were expected to have opinions. Being entirely without views was considered dull and socially useless. But the expression of those opinions was subject to a careful calibration based on audience and context. With close female friends, a woman might express herself with some directness. In mixed company, her opinions must be offered more tentatively, more quietly, more provisionally, as suggestions rather than assertions, as questions rather than statements, in a form that invited discussion rather than demanding agreement. Strong opinions expressed directly were considered unbecoming. That word again, always that word. Even when the opinion was correct, the directness of its expression could be the problem. There was the rule of invisible competence. A woman who was genuinely capable, who managed a household efficiently, who ran her professional duties with skill, who organized a social event with impressive smoothness, was expected to do all of this in a way that did not draw attention to her competence. The compliment she sought was not, quote, 13, but, quote, 14, or, quote, 15, as though the thing had happened by pleasant chance rather than by skilled effort. Making her competence visible was, paradoxically, evidence of insufficient competence, because a truly skilled woman made it all look easy. There was the rule of the second helping. When food was offered to a woman at table, the correct social response to particularly delicious food was controlled appreciation, not the frank, enthusiastic second helping that appetite might suggest. A woman who ate with obvious and uncomplicated enjoyment, who cleaned her plate and asked for more, was making a statement about the relationship between her body and its pleasures that was considered, in polite company, slightly excessive. Women were supposed to eat enough to maintain health and social functioning, not so much as to suggest that bodily pleasure was something they valued or pursued. There was the rule of the graceful exit from discomfort. If a woman found herself in a social situation that was uncomfortable, if a man was being inappropriate, if a conversation had gone somewhere she did not wish to follow, if she was being treated in a way that was unkind or unfair, the expected response was not to say so, not to name the discomfort, confront the cause of it, or create the kind of social disruption that addressing it directly would require. The expected response was to manage her own exit from the situation, with a slight redirect of the conversation, a gracious excuse to speak to someone else in the room. A change of subject so seamless that the discomfort was bypassed without anyone having to acknowledge that it existed. This was considered skill, sophisticated social navigation, the ability to move through difficult situations without creating scenes, and it was indeed a form of skill, requiring real intelligence and real self-control. But it also meant that the discomfort was never addressed, that the behaviour causing it was never challenged, that the woman absorbed it and managed it and moved on, and the pattern continued unchanged. There was the rule of domestic visibility. A woman whose home was impeccably managed was doing her job. A woman whose home was anything less was failing, not just at housekeeping, but at something more essential, more characterological. A dusty sitting room or an inferior cake or a poorly laundered tablecloth was evidence not just of carelessness, but of something uncomfortably close to inadequacy as a woman. This rule applied regardless of whether the woman in question also worked a full day in an office or a shop. The domestic standards did not relax because she was employed. They were simply added to everything else she was expected to do, and perhaps the most quietly devastating unwritten rule of all, the rule of cheerfulness. Women were expected to be, in the main, pleasant, not performing joy in a theatrical way. That was excessive and exhausting to be around. But consistently, reliably, cheerfully disposed toward the world. A woman who was frequently unhappy, not occasionally, not in the face of genuine grief or loss, but as a pattern of her engagement with daily life, was a woman who was difficult, hard to be around, not quite right. Something was wrong with a woman who was not. By and large, pleasant. This is perhaps the most remarkable rule of all when you sit with it, because no one ever asked women if the life they were living, the constant self-monitoring, the effortful appearance, the managed invisibility, the cheerful compliance was actually making them happy. No one quite asked the question, and women, following the rules, were cheerful anyway. They managed it. They found genuine pleasure in the parts of their lives that offered it. Friendships, children, creative work within domestic bounds, the real satisfaction of doing things well. They were not universally unhappy, but they were not, in most cases, entirely free. And the freedom they lacked was so thoroughly normalized that many women barely knew they were missing it. The rules were the world, and the world was the rules. And in the spaces between the rules, quietly, generation by generation, things were beginning to shift. It would be easy, from the distance of 100 years, to tell the story of 1920s women's etiquette rules as a story of pure constraint, a suffocating system maintained by tradition and enforced by community from which women were entirely powerless to escape. And there is truth in that story. The constraints were real. The power they exercised over women's lives was real, but it is not the whole story. Because running alongside the rigid architecture of expectation all through the decade was something else, a current of change, sometimes visible, sometimes underground, that was slowly, unevenly, but genuinely reshaping the world women lived in. The vote was real. It had been hard won, and its impact was not immediate. Voting rights alone do not transform a social system, and many women in the early 1920s were unsure how to use this new right, or were discouraged from using it, or simply found that the political world that the vote gave them access to was itself still structured in ways that marginalized their participation. But the vote meant something. It meant that the legal fiction of women as dependent, non-autonomous persons, a fiction that had underlain so much of the social architecture of the previous era, had been officially, if not socially, dismantled. The women who had fought for suffrage had not stopped fighting simply because the vote was won. They moved into new arenas, campaigning for women's health rights, for better working conditions, for the right to jury service and to hold public office, for access to higher education and professional training, for birth control information that would give women some degree of control over the number and spacing of their children. These campaigns were not always successful in the 1920s, but they were happening, they were shaping the conversation, and they were being conducted by women who had learned, in the suffrage movement, how to organise, how to argue publicly, and how to refuse the expectation of graceful silence when they had something important to say. The flappers were real too. They were a minority. Most young women in the 1920s were not flappers in the theatrical sense of the word. But the flapper as a cultural phenomenon mattered because she embodied something that had not been widely embodied before. A young woman who was openly, unapologetically doing what she wanted, who drank in public because she wanted to, who danced in jazz clubs because she wanted to, who wore her hair short and her skirts shorter because she wanted to, who went out at night without a chaperone because she wanted to, who smoked cigarettes in long holders on the steps of buildings where she was probably not supposed to be, and who did all of this with a kind of careless confidence that was, in the context of everything we have been describing, genuinely extraordinary. She paid for it, of course. Flappers were criticised extensively, right, by newspapers, by clergymen, by parents, by older women who felt that the hard-won gains of the previous generation were being squandered in gin-soaked jazz clubs. They were called frivolous, irresponsible, immodest. They were told that no respectable man would marry them if they continued to behave this way, which was intended as a devastating argument and sometimes actually was one. The rules did not smile on the flapper. Society made that clear. But she persisted, and her persistence mattered because it demonstrated something that is always worth demonstrating, that the rules could be broken, that the world did not in fact end when they were, and that the consequences, while real, were survivable. The working women who were quietly accumulating professional experience and economic independence were also part of the changing current. Each woman who demonstrated day after day that she could do the work, do it well, do it reliably, do it competently, was making an argument that would take decades to fully prevail, but that was being made nonetheless. Each woman who delayed marriage because her career mattered to her, or who returned to work after marriage despite the social pressure not to, or who achieved something professional that no woman before her had achieved, was shifting the picture slightly, adding one more data point to an argument about what women were capable of. The access to education was expanding slowly. More women were attending university by the 1920s than ever before, though they still faced significant barriers. Oxford University in England, for example, did not grant women full membership until 1920, and even then the atmosphere remained significantly unwelcoming. In America, women's colleges had existed for decades, but women's access to the great research universities remained limited, and the professions to which those universities led, law, medicine, academia, were still very largely male. But women were there, in increasing numbers, learning, training, building the foundations of professional identities that the next generation would benefit from. The literature of the decade was changing too. Women were writing, not just the domestic novels and romantic fiction that were considered appropriate female literary territory, but serious, ambitious, formally experimental literature. Virginia Woolf was writing, Catherine Mansfield was writing, Edith Wharton, Dorothy Parker, Willa Cather, women whose work dealt with the realities of female experience with a directness and complexity that etiquette books had spent a century trying to prevent women from expressing in public. Woolf, in particular, was thinking about what women needed in order to fully realize their creative and intellectual potential. The room of one's own, the independent income, the freedom from the constant self-monitoring and social management that consumed so much of women's time and energy. She was putting into words something that many women felt but had not had the language or the platform to articulate. Her essays and fiction were read, discussed, argued about, adding to the slowly building body of thought about what women's lives were and what they might become. The decade was not simple. Progress was uneven, contested, frequently reversed, and always harder than it should have been. The rules we have been exploring did not vanish in the 1920s. Many of them persisted well beyond the decade. Some of them persist in modified forms even now. The history of women's freedom is not a straight line from constraint to liberation, but a complicated, circuitous path with many setbacks and blind alleys and moments of genuine backward movement. But the 1920s were, in retrospect, a genuine hinge point, a decade in which the old structures were clearly weakening, even as they fought to maintain themselves. A decade in which women were more visible, more numerous in public life, more economically present, more culturally vocal than they had been before. A decade in which the distance between what women were officially allowed to be and what women were actually doing grew wide enough to be visible to almost everyone. The rules did not win. They never quite win, in the end. Not when the thing they are trying to contain is the entirety of half the human population. They slow things down, they create suffering, they extract an enormous price in wasted potential and stifled lives. But the current keeps moving, and in the 1920s the current was moving faster than it had in a long time. Let us return now to where we began. That cool autumn morning in 1922, the narrow bed, the ceramic pitcher, the oval mirror, the strand of pearls coiled beside the folded handkerchief. Let us stay there a little longer, in the quiet before the day begins. Outside, the street is still half asleep. The milk bottles have been collected. The delivery horse has moved on. The neighbour's radio is silent. In the kitchen below, the landlady's movements have stilled, and for a moment, the world is simply quiet. The particular early morning quiet that belongs to no particular era, that has sounded the same way in every decade before and after the one we have been visiting. In this quiet, she sits on the edge of the bed, not yet dressed, not yet performing, not yet the managed, careful, correctly presented version of herself that the world outside the door will require. Just herself for these few minutes before the rules begin again. What does she think about in this interval? We cannot know for certain, but we can imagine. She might be thinking about the letter she received last week from her sister in the city, who has cut her hair short and taken a new job, and sounds, in her writing, both frightened and exhilarated. She might be thinking about the book she's been reading in the evenings, slowly, in the 20 minutes before bed, a novel about a woman who does something she's not supposed to do and is not entirely destroyed by it. She might be thinking about the conversation at Mrs. Hartley's dinner party, the way the woman on her left had said something, casually as though it were obvious, about the absurdity of the marriage bar, and how 2 or 3 of the women around the table had met each other's eyes in a way that said yes, without requiring any words to be spoken. She might be thinking about none of these things. She might simply be sitting, in the quiet, feeling the early morning chill on her bare arms and listening to the stillness before the day begins. There is, in this moment, something she knows and something she does not yet know. She knows the rules. She knows them completely, the way you know the floor plan of a house you have lived in for a long time, not as a set of instructions, but as a physical fact, the way your feet find the stairs in the dark without counting them. She knows how to dress and how to move and how to speak and how to sit and how to eat and how to laugh and how to not laugh and how to manage the careful social performance of being a respectable woman in 1922, and she can do it well. She's always been able to do it well. What she does not yet know, what none of them quite know yet, standing where they stand in the decade, is how much of this is going to change. Not quickly, not easily, not without cost and struggle and the persistent friction of a world that does not change its rules without being pushed. But change it will. The current is already running under the surface of the carefully managed world she inhabits, and it will surface, decade by decade, generation by generation, carrying the accumulated force of all the women who sat in all the quiet rooms and thought their quiet thoughts before the rules began again. She rises. She goes to the washstand. She begins the careful, practiced work of becoming presentable. But somewhere underneath the performance, underneath the straight spine and the correct hat and the careful smile and the managed laugh, she carries something that no rule could quite reach, the inner life that the rules were designed to contain but never quite succeeded in erasing. The thoughts that moved in the quiet before the day began and kept moving all day beneath the surface of everything that was expected of her. That was what the rules never managed to govern. Not fully, not finally. And that is why we're still here 100 years later telling her story. Here is what we have not yet told you. Every etiquette manual published in the 1920s, every conduct guide, every ladies' magazine column, every carefully printed list of rules governing how a woman should walk and sit and speak and laugh and dress and eat and feel, was written, in the overwhelming majority of cases, by women. not by men issuing edicts from positions of authority, not by governments or churches or professional bodies, though all of those contributed their own pressures. The books that told women how to be women, the ones that specified the angle of the soup spoon and the appropriate duration of a parlour call and the correct shade of lipstick for a respectable afternoon outing, were largely written by women who had themselves grown up inside the system, internalised its requirements completely, and then set about codifying those requirements for the next generation. Women like Emily Post, whose landmark Etiquette book was first published in 1922 and became one of the best-selling books of the entire decade. A woman who was herself sophisticated, widely travelled, professionally accomplished, and genuinely intelligent, and who used that intelligence to construct with enormous care and considerable skill one of the most comprehensive maps of the rules that governed women's lives ever assembled. She believed in those rules. Not naively, not without nuance. Post's etiquette book is, on careful reading, rather more flexible and pragmatic than its reputation suggests, and she had a dry wit that surfaces in unexpected places. But she believed that the social order the rules maintained was worth maintaining, that the rituals of courtesy and decorum and careful behaviour served a genuine human function, that the alternative to the rules was not freedom, but chaos. She was not alone in this belief. The women who wrote etiquette columns and hosted radio programmes about domestic management and published guides to correct behaviour for young women were, by and large, genuinely convinced that what they were doing was helpful, that they were giving women the tools they needed to navigate a complicated social world, that the rules, properly understood, were not a cage but a map, and that having a map was better than having nothing. And here is the real twist, the one that sits beneath even this one. They were not entirely wrong. The rules were genuinely constraining, genuinely costly, genuinely unjust in many of their applications, but they also provided something real, a shared social language, a set of expectations that both sides understood, a structure within which relationships could be built and maintained and trust could be established. In a world before many of the social technologies we now take for granted, before the informal communication that smartphones enable, before the reduced formality of modern professional and social life, the rules gave women a framework for navigating public life that was, in its own way, a form of power. Because knowing the rules better than anyone else, and women did because they had to, because the consequences of getting it wrong fell on them, was a form of competence. Mastering the language of a social system, even a system that was not designed for your benefit, is a form of intelligence, and the women who mastered it most completely were, within the constraints of their world, genuinely powerful. The hostess who ran the perfect dinner party was exercising real skill, real organisational intelligence, real social authority. The woman who could navigate a difficult social situation with perfect grace, who could manage the comfort of a room full of people while appearing to do nothing at all, who could turn the complex machinery of social life to her own purposes while appearing merely to be following its requirements, she was doing something genuinely remarkable. The rules were the cage, but the women who mastered the rules had, in mastering them, built something inside the cage that belonged entirely to themselves. That is the final twist. The system that was designed to constrain women was maintained, refined, and transmitted primarily by women. And the women who did this were not simply victims of false consciousness, not merely internalizing their own oppression, not acting against their own interests in a simple or straightforward way. They were making complicated choices in a complicated world, finding power where they could find it, building the best lives available to them within the structures that existed, and, in many cases, laying the groundwork, through the very institutions they created and maintained, for the changes that would eventually come. The etiquette book that told a young woman how to hold her soup spoon also taught her to read, to reason, to organise her thoughts and express them with clarity. The social skills that the parlour required, the careful reading of others, the management of complex group dynamics, the ability to navigate competing interests with tact and intelligence were transferable. They transferred slowly and imperfectly but genuinely into the professional world, the political world, the public world that women were beginning to enter in the 1920s and would continue to enter in increasing numbers and with increasing authority in the decades that followed. The rules did not win, But neither did they simply lose. They transformed, absorbed into the women who had lived inside them, carried forward into a changing world where they gradually became something else, something less constraining and more chosen, something that looked less like a cage and more like a tradition freely adopted or freely set aside. She rises from the edge of the bed. She goes to the washstand. She begins the careful, practiced work of becoming presentable, and outside the street is waking up. The milk bottles on the doorsteps are filling with morning light. Somewhere down the road, a radio switches on. A jazz melody, thin and bright, floating out through an open window into the autumn air. She hears it. For just one moment before the rules resume, she lets herself listen. Then she straightens her spine, picks up the hairbrush, meets her own eyes in the small oval mirror, and begins. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one.